WTAM 1100? Who's a bigger influence on rock music, Elvis or the Beatles? Log on and vote at WTAM.com.
This is the big one. Now, continuing coverage on News Radio, WTAM 1100, Cleveland.
Fans of good music are mourning the passing of George Harrison. The quiet Beatle died Thursday of cancer. His family says George left the world conscious of God, fearless of death, and at peace. The man who brought the sitar into popular music spoke of his legacy.
I got born seemingly to become Beatle George. But it doesn't really matter who you are or what you are. That's only a temporary sort of tag for a limited sort of period of years.
Harrison was 58. Hear an hour-long special about Harrison's life in minutes here on The Big One, and Magic 105.7 highlights Harrison's music all weekend long.
News Radio, WTAM 1100.
This is a special presentation from ABC News. A Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison. From the early days,
I never really wanted to be a policeman or a fireman or anything like that. I just wanted to be in a band.
Oh yeah, tell you something. I think you'll understand.
to life after the Beatles.
It doesn't take long to be from 17 to being 57. 40 years just goes like that.
And the effect his music had on millions.
Wherever you go in the world, he's very well known, so I'm sure people are, sad everywhere.
I remember skipping church to see them on the Ed Sullivan Show, so it was, they were just part of my life forever.
While my guitar gently weeps.
A Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison. From New York City, ABC News correspondent Tim Sheld.
The man known as the Quiet Beatle was silenced Thursday afternoon. George Harrison lost his battle with cancer and died with his wife and son by his side at a friend's Los Angeles home. Harrison was a musician, a singer, songwriter, a guitarist whose influence was felt around the world because he was part of a phenomenon the likes of which the entertainment world had never seen and may never see again. George Harrison was a Beatle. He also helped produce music and movies. He raced cars, embraced Eastern culture and religion, and he loved comedy. But he was a Beatle, and the world will never forget it. It's why news of his passing has touched so many. Beatles' story started in Britain, and that is where we begin, with ABC's Kate Bowie.
Perhaps it wasn't official, but it was a day of mourning across the British nation following the news of George Harrison's death. And it wasn't long before we heard from the man we'd been waiting for, Paul McCartney, who emerged from his London home to admit he was devastated. They had remained friends, and McCartney said he'd visited Harrison only a few weeks ago.
I found out last night, and I'm devastated, obviously, like everyone is. He had a long battle with his cancer. But I saw him a few weeks ago, and he was full of fun, like he always was. He's such a brave lad. To me, he's just my little baby brother. We grew up together, and I knew him in my old hometown, Liverpool. And we just had so many beautiful times together that's what I'm going to remember him by. A lovely guy who's full of humor, as I say, even when I saw him last time, and he was obviously very unwell. He was still cracking jokes like he always was, and he'll be sorely missed. He's a beautiful man, and the world will miss him. So that's really all I can manage to say at the moment. And I'd just like to ask everyone, mainly the media, to be very kind to Olivia and Danny, his wife and son, at this moment when they're going to need a lot of help and support. Well, we've known he's been ill for a long time. I think everyone has, but we always hoped that there'd be some miracle happen. But he's, like I say, he's such a brave guy and a beautiful man, and we're all going to miss him.
The other remaining Beatle, Ringo Starr, also expressed his love for Harrison. In a written statement, Ringo said he'd miss his friend and his sense of love, music, and friendship. And John Lennon's widow, Yoko Ono, praised Harrison for his music, wit, and wisdom. Tributes to Harrison poured in from Britain's music and film industry. But it didn't stop there. In the House of Commons, weepy members of Parliament admitted having difficulty carrying on normal business. And Prime Minister Tony Blair said Harrison was a symbol of his generation.
It's worth pointing out that he wasn't just a great musician and artist, but he did an immense amount for charity as well. And so he will be very, very sadly missed by people right around the world.
As As news spread, small shrines of remembrance began springing up. In London, fans gathered at the Abbey Road recording studios, writing their goodbyes on the white walls. In Oxfordshire, people left flowers at the gates of Harrison's huge, high-walled mansion. And in Liverpool, where the Beatles were born, flags flew at half-staff, and books of condolence were opened at City Hall and at the Cavern Club, where the band first played in public. Liverpudlians felt they'd lost a man who'd never forgotten his working-class roots.
Pretty upset, to be honest. Although I knew about a week ago that it was possible that he could die in the next 2 weeks, I wasn't really quite prepared for that to happen today.
Oh, I'm devastated, I really am. I mean, although it was partly expected, I suppose, the battle against cancer, but it's very tragic. He was a brilliant guitarist and such an inspiration.
Despite George Harrison's trouble handling mega fame, years after the Beatles broke up, he told a British newspaper that they'd had the time of their lives. They'd laughed for years. His own tribute, perhaps, to a band that rocked the world. Tim?
There are places I remember.
There are some people who can tell you exactly where they were when they first heard the Beatles. Others can map life's milestones to Beatles records. Songs like this one make up a tapestry of memories for some, evoking images of old friends, lovers, a feeling, a place. Such is the power of the music the Beatles blessed us with. Even today, their influence on popular music cannot be overstated. And now another of them is gone. With the death of George Harrison, we look at his life, his music, and says Spin magazine editor-in-chief Alan Light.
Well, I think the Beatles tower over all pop music in such a dramatic way that you have to start by looking at that. I think it is almost impossible to come up with such a thing as a pop musician of any sort from the last almost 4 decades now who was not touched in some way by the work of the Beatles. They completely transformed what pop music is, how it works, what a band is capable of.
And while George Harrison may have operated in the shadow of songwriting giants Paul McCartney and John Lennon, Alan Light says he made his mark.
At the most basic level, George Harrison was a guitar player. And the idea of being a lead guitar player in a band like that was incredibly influential just as a musician.
But George Harrison was much, much more. Rolling Stone magazine contributing editor Anthony DeCurtis.
Harrison was always known as the quiet Beatle, and I think that quietness had quite an air of mystery about it. And I think that's one of his legacies, you know. I think his real gift was for the kind of mystical view of life that he brought to their music and to popular music in general.
A Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues after this.
The WTAM 1100 Who's a bigger influence on rock music, Elvis or the Beatles? Log on and vote at WTAM.com.
A Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues. Now, ABC's Tim Sheld.
For the Beatles, it all began in a place called Liverpool, England, where George was born in 1943.
As kind as she could be. I had a good mom.
He was one of 4 children of Harold and Louise Harrison. His father's love of American country music classics like Jimmie Rodgers helped fuel George's own love of music. George seemed to love everyone, from Elvis to Motown. But he seemed to have a special place in his heart for the guitar playing of one Carl.
12 and 13, I heard loads of blues, because Liverpool, being a seaport, had a lot of mixture, we had all kinds, Indians, Chinese, and, sailors coming from everywhere bringing. My first American guitar bought off a sailor in Liverpool, Gretsch. I liked anything, when I was a kid, anything with a guitar on it,
A year or 2 later, George Harrison met Paul McCartney, an older schoolmate he rode the bus with. The two had a common interest in music, and they began playing together. McCartney was already in a band with John Lennon. Paul McCartney remembers George Harrison being asked to join the band.
You'd get a guy in a group just because he knew a certain song. George Harrison got in because he knew a thing called Raunchy. It was by Bill Justice. George could play that on guitar. I said to the guys, I said, I've got this little friend, because he was younger than me. I said, I've got this little friend at school. I said, and he can play raunchy on the guitar. They said, no, because like nobody could do that. You know, that's like, it's virtually impossible. We know that, you know. I said, no, I swear, I'll bring him along and I'll prove it. So I took George along, and I remember being on the top deck of a double-decker bus that we've got, like the buses we've got in England. And we're up there. I said, go on, George, play raunchy. You know, like a trained dog. Play. And he went down, 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 down. And we went, like our mouths fell open. That was George in the group.
The three young men would play together in a series of bands the next few years, including the Quarrymen and the Silver Beatles. John Lennon fondly remembered.
You know, you went to see those movies with Elvis or somebody in it when we were still in Liverpool. And you'd see everybody waiting to see him, right? And I'd be waiting there too. And they'd all scream when he came on the screen. Right? So we thought, that's a good job.
It wouldn't be long before the screams would be for the Beatles. With Ringo Starr added in 1962, the Beatles as we know them were on their way.
Fading away. That's the end of the day.
In February of 1964, the Beatles arrived in America for an appearance on the Ed Sullivan television variety show.
Now, yesterday and today, our theater's been jammed with newspapermen and hundreds of photographers from all over the nation, and these veterans agree with me that the city never has witnessed the excitement stirred by these youngsters from Liverpool who call themselves the Beatles. Now, tonight, you're going to twice be entertained by them. Right now, and again in the second half of our show. Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
The rest, as they say, is history. Rolling Stone magazine contributing editor Anthony DeCurtis.
Grew up in New York City, and I was 12 years old when the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan. You know, and that was the end of that. I mean, that was, you know, the end. I mean, as a kid, that was everything. I mean, and at least as I recollect it now, I just knew it. I mean, that was in some way what I wanted to do, what I wanted to be like, what I wanted to think about.
But it wasn't just the music.
Question, would you be quiet, please?
Could you please sing something?
No! Sorry.
Next question.
We can sing. No, we need money first.
It was the way they looked, the way they talked, their irreverence, their humor, their timing. Anthony DeCurtis.
The Beatles changed the world. I mean, that was, as far as I'm concerned, the Beatles coming to America was the beginning of the cultural version of the 60s. You know, obviously the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests were, you know, the beginning of the political wing of the 60s. But culturally, it started when the Beatles came to America. That was when it began.
It was an ear-splitting mop-top craze, and George was on the ride of his life.
George Harrison, you're one of the reputed deep thinkers of this group. How do you see it as a peak in your life? What happens to you after this is over?
Well, I suppose we'll stay doing this sort of stuff for a couple of years. And whether we're, I mean, naturally we won't be able to stay at this level, but we should have another 2 years at least, I think.
Then what happens? What happens to George Harrison then?
I don't know. I'll know by the time that comes along. Probably have a little business or something like that.
You don't want to go on in the profession?
Probably, yeah. I'd like to make records, you know, with other artists. I don't mean perform, I mean as a producer.
Beatle historian Martin Lewis says while Beatlemania was a phenomenon that may never be repeated, The music they produced during this time was extraordinary.
My mentor, who was the Beatles publicist, a wonderful chap called Derek Taylor, once remarked that the Beatles story is so fantastic that if it hadn't have happened, no one would have had the imagination to come up with it, and you would never have had the temerity to suggest it could happen. In these days, when artists of high caliber might record an album of 10 songs, they take about a year and a half to record those songs, then they might tour, then take a couple of years off to recuperate from the strain, and then record maybe another 10 songs. In the years between 1963 and 1970, the Beatles recorded an average of 2 albums a year. These were British albums with 14 songs on them, plus 4 singles that weren't on the album each year, 4 separate singles. That was the way it was done in those days, plus writing songs for other people, plus touring the world, plus making 4 movies. And the remarkable thing is, not only did they do this enormous quantity in a very short space of time, but the quality was good, but not only that the quality was good, but they, by some strange alchemy, they actually grew in leaps and bounds and broke down boundaries.
During the 1960s, the Beatles dominated the charts like no group had ever before. Just months after their Sullivan Show appearance in 1964, the 5 best-selling singles and the 2 best-selling albums on the U.S. charts belonged to the Beatles. Much of the magic came from the legendary songwriting team of Lennon and McCartney. But Spin Magazine's Alan Light says George's contributions were also significant.
You write a song like Something, you write a song like Here Comes the Sun, that's going to live for a mighty long time, and that's as you know, the B-list songwriter within the group. But there were some extraordinary songs that George wrote,
including this one, Something. Paul McCartney remembers,
we never really reckoned George as a writer. So you tended to think, well, if there's going to be a single, it would be John or me, or John and me that would write it. And then suddenly George just came up with this song, you know, something in the way. And I mean, the irony of it was, when we started off, you were trying to get Frank Sinatra to do your song. You know, it's like, it was the ultimate of if Frank does one of our songs, we're made. And of course, the only bloody one he ever did was Something, was George's. I don't think he ever did a Lennon McCartney in the end. You get all the something in the way she moves. It's one of them now.
Something in the way she moves.
I wrote it at the time when we were making the last double album, and it's just the first line, Something in the Way She Moved, which has been in millions of songs. It's not a special thing, but it just seemed quite apt.
George didn't write this one, but he did contribute to its texture. Though he was the youngest Beatle, George Harrison helped lead his mates on a path of spiritual awakening and musical exploration into Eastern cultures and religion. Harrison's curiosity with an instrument called the sitar was a catalyst. Paul McCartney remembers,
We were all getting into various different kinds of music, and George's became Indian. I think all of us were listening to sort of classical and various types of music other than our own and our rock and roll kind of roots. And George just sort of moved into the Indian thing. I think he'd give you a better explanation of just sort of when it was.
Well, actually, during the filming of Hell, there was some Indian musicians in a restaurant scene, and I kind of messed around with the sitar then.
Rolling Stone magazine's Anthony DeCurtis.
The reverberations from that are still being felt. And, you know, Harrison kind of opened people's eyes to the music of the rest of the world.
But the Beatles' success began to get the better of them. Business got in the way of friendship. Interests diverged. There were drugs, controversy, and George remembers a very public tiff with Paul McCartney during a recording session for the album and film Let It Be.
There was a bit of a row going on between Paul and I. You can see it where he's saying, well, don't play this or something, and I'm saying, well, you know, I'll play what you want, or I won't play if you don't want it, you know, just make up your mind. That kind of stuff was going on. Well, I don't think you should. Okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, you know, whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. No, whatever. I thought I'm quite
capable of being relatively happy on my own, and I'm not able to be happy in this situation. You know, I'm getting out of here.
By 1971, the Beatles were history. George once said,
you know, what was it like to be a Beatle? You know, well, who knows? I mean, what's it like not to be one, you know? We only know what we have done, and we are what we've done, and that seems to have been the destiny predetermined for us, probably by something we did in the past.
Coming up, life after the Beatles. When a Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues after this. A Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues. Now from New York, ABC News correspondent Tim Schelt.
Unlike most Beatle fans, George Harrison was not upset that the Beatles had broken up. In fact, just listen to the title of George's first solo effort, an album called All Things Must Pass. It was actually a 3-record set that said more about how hard it was for George Harrison to get his writing on Beatles records. Spin magazine editor-in-chief Alan Light.
I think with George, what All Things Must Pass especially was this backlog of songs he'd been building up over the last few years. Once he started writing with the Beatles, still there was this sense of, well, we'll give you one song an album, maybe we'll give you 2 by the end. You know, if you're going to come with something and Here Comes the Sun for Abbey Road, okay, we'll give you both of those. But in the meantime, he was writing and building up these songs, and then All Things Must Pass came out, which was a triple album. And there was this sense of, well, where's this guy been? Where are these songs coming from? We knew he was good, but we didn't know he had all this in him.
As a result, All Things Must Pass was a hit. On the 30th anniversary of its release earlier this year, George Harrison recalled,
I didn't really pay much attention to the charts. It's only now that, you know, people keep saying All Things Must Pass was up there for 7 weeks or whatever. I didn't really notice, you know. I mean, I'm not really very good at statistics, or, you know, I like to just do something and let it go and then forget about it.
The album included Harrison's most popular solo single, My Sweet Lord, a reflection of the path his life had taken since the Beatles.
It was very nice, really. I mean, I got a lot of response from that record from people. I mean, half the Hare Krishnas joined because of that.
I'd just like to say before we start off with the concert that to thank you all for coming here.
It was right around this time that Harrison's friend, fellow musician Ravi Shankar, came to him with a plea for help. Years of war, recent flooding, and famine was turning Bangladesh into a killing field. Harrison responded immediately, recording a single, organizing concerts at Madison Square Garden for Bangladesh. Beatles historian Martin Lewis.
At that point, he was incredibly popular, incredibly successful. He could have gone out on tour, he could have done any number of concerts and made a huge amount of money for himself. His first instinct, his first solo work, no. He wanted to do a concert for Bangladesh, and he called in the favors. He called up Bob Dylan, a friend. He called up Leon Russell, who was at that time a major rock artist. Billy Preston. He called in other friends and musicians. He got Ravi Shankar there, of course, and he put on the concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Gardens. 2 concerts in one evening, filmed and recorded. And that made not just money. It did something as, if not more important, it raised consciousness, it raised awareness, not just of the Bangladesh issue, but it also raised awareness that there was something that rock stars could do. They didn't just have to sit in their fancy houses and put out records and make tons of money and have no social conscience. They could actually do something.
Rolling Stone's Anthony DeCurtis says Harrison's life after the Beatles was off and running.
All Things Must Pass was quickly followed up by the concert for Bangladesh, and at that point, he had really stepped onto the world stage. With that show, he set the template for what these huge rock and roll benefit concerts would be. And then he would recede into the background. He toured America in 1974. That was the last time he toured. Then it wasn't heard from for a while. At the end of the 80s, came back again with an album called Cloud 9. Got involved with the Travelin' Wilburys with, Tom Petty and Bob Dylan and Roy Orbison. And that was another great moment for him.
It was 1988, and George Harrison was part of a musical supergroup with a sense of humor. The Traveling Wilburys featured Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, and Jeff Lynne. Not only did it prove Harrison still had it, they had fun doing it, and they won a Grammy in the process. In January of 1988, Harrison was there when the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
We all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all loved Paul very much.
This was a rare public appearance for George Harrison in those days. He never liked the public spotlight, and in December of 1981, he had even more reason to pull away.
In a combat stance, he emptied the Charter Arms .38 caliber gun that he had with him and shot John Lennon.
George Harrison would later explain,
I don't fear for my life like some people try to suggest. You know, they said since John Lennon got killed, I go and hide, and I've got a big fence around my property. I had the fence around my property back in 1965, you know.
Spin Magazine's Alan Light explains it this way.
Number one, I think it's always easy to understand why somebody would pull away after being in the center of that sort of mayhem for those years. What's left to prove? I mean, what do you still need to go out to do? And I think with George, his spirituality was something that then colored a lot of the rest of his life after 1966, 1967. That didn't go away. That was still at the core of what he did, and he still was, adhering to the Eastern philosophies that he had learned. He was still meditating and all of those things. I think that stayed with him forever. And I think after the band, after trying some time with the solo career, and then and certainly after John's murder, I think trying to sort of get right within himself was much more, became much more important than feeling I need to go out and be a pop star.
Light also says Harrison wasn't the recluse he was made out to be.
I mean, we can say he's this private recluse, just living in his own meditation world, but he was also out there driving crazy sports car, race cars around and taking that stuff, pretty, like, he was into it. That was not something every once in a while he liked to drive fast. He was into that thing. So I think there was this more playful side to him that he just didn't, he wasn't going to go out and do sketch comedy. He wasn't going to go and show everybody what a fun guy he was. But there were things that obviously became important to him and became important to what his life was about.
In 1979, Harrison formed Handmade Films, trying his hand at movie producing with Monty Python's Life of Brian, and later, Time Bandits. He once told ABC's Good Morning America,
everybody needs to make a living or do something just to keep themselves busy, and so might as well continue doing the thing that we learned. We sort of did our apprenticeship. The thing that's, I think the pressure is coming now from the other way, because the record business as a whole, it's, everybody's in the record business, everybody and their grannies.
But then came the 1990s.
The story of Harrison in the 90s was sad in many ways, not because his life was unhappy, but because as the Beatles would go through these spurts with the Beatles anthologies and the collections of Beatles #1 hits, Harrison was in the background because he had gotten ill, toward the end of the decade. I wasn't able to really come out the way he might otherwise have done.
In 1998, George Harrison revealed he had been treated for throat cancer. And while the cancer would eventually kill him, we almost lost George as 1999 turned to the year 2000.
The question now is whether this was a burglary attempt that went wrong or whether it was from the beginning supposed to be a personal attack on George Harrison.
Harrison recovered from a collapsed lung, but his cancer was spreading. And earlier this year, he would reveal he had treatment for a brain tumor. Just a few months ago, he celebrated the 30th anniversary of the release of All Things Must Pass.
The whole idea of, all things must pass is a very philosophical thing,
sunrise doesn't last all morning, and you know, a cloudburst doesn't last all day, and a sunset doesn't last all evening.
Coming up, what his life and work meant to others. When a Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues after this. A Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues. Now, ABC's Tim Sheld.
Over the past few months, George Harrison's death was both predicted and expected. Only a few days ago, while he was receiving treatment here in New York, Harrison had tearful goodbyes with both Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. And on word of his passing,
I'm very sad. Believe me, I'm just like a broken heart.
Tears flowed from New York to Hollywood. At the Beatles Star along the Walk of Fame Friday.
People of all ages have been coming here since very early this morning, actually since dark this morning. They've been coming by. A lot of people are old enough, certainly, to remember the Beatles, but there have been some younger people, people with T-shirts, many of them wearing dark clothes. A few have stopped by to say prayers, and there has even been some weeping here.
Even at the White House.
The president is very saddened by the death of George Harrison. He considers the Beatles to be one of the greatest groups of any time in music.
Alan Light of Spin Magazine says to look at the impact of George Harrison on the world of music.
Well, I think the Beatles tower over all pop music in such a dramatic way that you have to start by looking at that. I think it is almost impossible to come up with such a thing as a pop musician of any sort from the last almost 4 decades now who was not touched in some way by the work of the Beatles.
As for Harrison's role in all of that, Beatle historian Martin Lewis.
George Harrison has been the most underrated member of the Beatles and perhaps one of the most underrated members of that rock generation.
Much of his impact can be traced to his exploration with world music. Rolling Stone magazine's Anthony DeCurtis.
Harrison was not really content with the Beatles being pop stars. In fact, he was very discontent with that. And his interest in Eastern culture was a way for him to explore other things. And when he introduced the sitar into the Beatles' music, it was dramatic. And even as an element in their songs, there weren't many songs in which they used it. Its impact was profound. It suggested, as so many of the Beatles' gestures did, it suggested so many other possibilities. And, you know, the reverberations from that are still being felt.
Influence that can even be heard today.
I mean, it's not simply this artist or that artist. You certainly can talk about Western artists like Peter Gabriel or Paul Simon, and you can trace that back to what Harrison was doing with the Beatles. You know, their interest in African music and Middle Eastern music is, really a straight line back to what Harrison was doing with Indian music.
DeCurtis also says George Harrison should be given credit for showing pop musicians the impact they could have on the world they live in. Beatle historian Martin Lewis wholeheartedly agrees.
The contribution made by George Harrison as a pioneer of rock musicians being involved in good causes and charitable works cannot be overstated. He was the pioneer. Yes, there had been large concerts with multiple artists and festivals such as Woodstock, Monterey, Altamont, Isle of Wight. But these were without any major charitable benefit. They might have had as a side attraction where we're going to give a few dollars to a good cause, but they weren't staged for that reason. Until 1971, when George Harrison put on the concert for Bangladesh, no rock star had ever thought to do that.
But Spin Magazine's Alan Light says musically George Harrison's contributions will also hold up.
At the most basic level, George Harrison was a guitar player, and the idea of being a lead guitar player in a band like that was incredibly influential just as a musician.
Rolling Stone magazine's DeCurtis looks at it this way.
Harrison was always known as the quiet Beatle, and I think that quietness had quite an air of mystery about it. And I think that's one of his legacies, He seemed, even when the Beatles were at their poppiest, Harrison lent them an air of kind of strangeness and mysticism and spirituality. And I think that is his legacy.
Here in New York, this Beatle fan may have said it best.
Every enduring relationship in my life has been defined by a Beatles song. I mean, I learned how to sing I Hold Your Hand when I was, 4, and I just said to somebody else, if you want a good cry, you listen to Imagine, but if you want to feel happy, you listen to Here Comes the Sun. It's
alright. Coming up, final thoughts about the life and death of George Harrison. When a Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues after this. A Beatle Remembered, the life of George Harrison continues. Now from New York, ABC News correspondent Tim Scheld.
This was the last song that George Harrison put out before he died. It's called Horse to the Water, a track off a UK release last week from Jules Holland. Yes, George can still sell albums. And yes, his loss is being felt by more than just baby boomers and children of the 60s. Beatle historian Martin Lewis says he sees it in the crowds that gather for Beatle fests across the country these days. 3/4 of them, he says, under the age of 25.
These are people who were not even born when the Beatles broke up. So when the cynics, or the blue meanies, as we say in the Beatles world, scoff and say, oh, it's all about nostalgia, it's just a bunch of baby boomers clinging to the past.